All right, thanks, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to talk through this first part on changing responsibilities of SEAs in this school year. Go to the next slide. So we're going to think about this in two ways. First, what are the responsibilities that are likely to change? Either that change because you as an SEA are choosing to take it on, changing it because it has to be done. New responsibilities, slight tweaks to responsibilities, but how are things going to be different for you versus previous years? And then within some of these, what we'd like to do is help give you a set of basically examples and questions that you can think through within these responsibilities to figure out, have we thought of everything? Have we thought of most things? And if we haven't thought of them, when can we do that? And how do we get ahead of what might come up in October and November and March so that it doesn't catch us by surprise then. So we know, I mean, as Steve said, it's been 200 webinars with CCSSO. It feels like every week is just a focus on that week, every day is a focus on that day. What we hope to do though is give you a chance, at least for the next 30 minutes or so, to kind of lift your heads up and think about what will October, what will November, what will March look like. What we have on this page are basically 7 categories of work. These should look familiar because a lot of this is work that you've been doing for years. But what we want to talk about is what we're hearing from SEAs within each of these categories on how this work will be different. Whether that's, again, slight tweaks to the work that you've been doing or completely new responsibilities given the circumstances. Let's look at the next page quickly. So here, what we've laid out are within each of these 7 categories: coordinating with other agencies, teaching and learning, data assessment and accountability, communication, policy and strategy setting, operations, and funding. We've listed a range of examples of changes to responsibilities, from slight changes to the top to larger changes at the bottom. Again, all of these are examples that we've heard from conversations with SEAs. Also, many of these we've seen internationally where ministries are taking on some new responsibilities like this. We don't expect that many SEAs will do all of these new things. Many will do some, but not all. But again, what we hope to be able to do here is kind of give a long list of potential things that you might want to consider taking on differently, so that you're able to kind of get ahead and think of everything. So I just talked through quickly some of these in coordinating with other agencies. Look, this is something that SEAs have done for a long time. It has looked different for the last several months already in light of COVID-19, liaising with governor's offices, legislature, health agencies, and this is likely to continue for many SEAs, especially down towards the bottom, which we're going to talk about later today. As conditions on the ground change, this coordination is going to continue to be important, and SEAs may find themselves continuing to coordinate with health agencies to monitor the health situation, either statewide or in individual counties and districts, and help LEAs figure out what to do, potentially even revise guidance overall at the state level. Within teaching and learning, we're hearing that SEAs are thinking about, of course, putting a different emphasis on remote and virtual instruction and all sorts of supports related to that, ranging from changing the type of professional developments they make available to LEAs, all the way to potentially providing devices, providing options for connectivity, or even full-time virtual schools that LEAs can take advantage of if they choose for their students and their families. In the realm of data assessments and accountabilities, again, conditions will be different this year. So we're hearing SEAs, do everything from providing LEAs with ideas for new mechanisms of tracking various elements such as attendance, ways that they can check in on student well-being and social and emotional elements, all the way down to advising on baseline assessments for us for understanding any learning loss that's happened up until the beginning of the year, so that schools and teachers know where to start with their students. In community engagement, essentially what we're hearing is the bar is just higher this year. So many of the things that have always happened need to happen faster and with more stakeholders than have happened in the past. So we're hearing SEA's plan to do things like bringing together stakeholder groups to share knowledge, either among parents, schools, but also pairing LEAs with each other so that they can wrestle through some of these problems together. We're hearing SEAs set up extra capacity to answer questions that might come in that they've never received before, or figuring out how to route those questions to other agencies that may be appropriate. In the realm of policy, many SEAs have already gone through and figured out which areas of policy and guidelines might they need to or want to adjust and give flexibility, which areas they may not. We're hearing SEAs say that this is probably going to be an ongoing exercise, that throughout the year they'll likely reassess and potentially make new decisions as again conditions change. In operations, we're hearing SEAs some provide more guidance than they've provided before on tactical things like setting school calendars at the granular level, all the way to sometimes providing really specific guidance or even common procurement of some more tactical operations issues that typically are simply the purview of LEAs. And then finally, on funding, there's no question that this will be an issue this year. And we're hearing that SEAs are expecting to do everything from simply be a resource and to advise LEAs on tough decisions, all the way to if there is additional funding that might come from some sources, being ready to allocate that funding strategically. What we'd like to do now is talk through a couple of these. And again, our hope is that by giving examples of the range of things other SEAs are taking on and some questions that you might ask of yourselves or your teams on your readiness, again, this will help expand the horizon of your thinking a little bit so you can get ahead of some of these responsibilities you might have. In coordination with other agencies, the big one that is certainly on folks' minds most recently are coordination with health agencies, whether that be SEAs coordinating with state health agencies, but also one example is contact tracing. So we've heard at least one SEA that has advised for protocols for schools when they have a confirmed case of a student or a teacher with COVID, that the protocol should not only be to alert the district or the LEA, to then alert family members, but also the county health department, which then alert the state health department. And some SEAs are actually trying to keep track of anything that rolls up to state departments from schools as well, so that the SEA has that visibility and is able to have a fact base for continued conversations both with the SEAs and with the LEAs. We're also hearing about more collaboration with other cabinet agencies, such as the Department of Agriculture, when providing assistance for students with respect to meals, especially in a remote model. Key questions that you could ask of yourselves or of your teams here are, when thinking about if you're ready for these levels of collaboration, are what systems and structures and communication channels do we already have set up with each of these relevant agencies? Who on our team is responsible for it? Do we have the right capacity given the increased communication and collaboration that we're going to need? What are we going to do if there's conflicting guidance between two or more of these bodies? How do we work with the legislature and the governor's office to optimize resources and funds and share our perspective, if we have a perspective, on what those funds should be and what guardrails should be put on them? And then finally, how do we get ahead of and both inform and have advance, notice on any new priorities that are coming out from the governor's office or any other agency when things are changing, on a day by day, week by week basis, and how do we what processes do we have in place to respond? Some examples that we've heard of how SEAs are doing this is setting up, twice a week meetings with the Department of Health and the governor's office together on issues related to health and safety. Basically, a mechanism they've had in place for the last several months, but plans to continue that into the school year, and using essentially a common set of data provided by the Department of Health to have conversations on health and safety that might be relevant for LEAs. In teaching and learning, there's obviously been a big emphasis on remote learning, and this is the big change from prior years. Whether that's fully virtual, fully remote for students full time, or whether it's in a hybrid model, SEAs are responding. Typically, this is happening in three areas in professional development: by designing new training or tweaking the training that you've been providing, or facilitating community learning among LEAs, for example, pairing strong districts with districts who may need support on some specific areas. We see this internationally in the UAE, where they're partnering both schools, but also high and low performing districts together, matching on specific topics so that they can work with each other to solve problems where maybe in this case, the central ministry doesn't have the answers. So we're seeing SEAs consider this and start setting up structures to enable this throughout the year. On remote learning, again, I mentioned earlier, SEAs are providing detailed suggestions on best practices for virtual learning, providing some specific tools and resources, even providing the online platform or setting up a fully virtual school that families and LEAs can opt into themselves. And then we're also seeing SEAs already develop some content, crowdsourcing videos of lessons that from teachers that can be made available to LEAs or individual teachers to use if they'd like. And then providing flexibility and otherwise supporting LEAs in providing extra learning time for students who may need it, either over summer or winter break, through helping with grants to fund extra adults to provide tutoring services or extra time for teachers, et cetera. Again, options that LEAs can opt into to support the work that they're trying to do. Another example here, one SEA has talked about how they are, because they don't have the capacity on virtual learning, they're actively sourcing that capacity. The example on this page is for providing specialized training directly to LEAs that they can then use with their teachers. But another area where we've heard SEAs are outsourcing to expand their own capacity is in the realm of offering virtual platforms or virtual schools. In data assessments and accountability, much of what I'm sure we're hearing in the press is around the compliance elements of this and what are we going to do with the high stakes tests in the spring. But there are a number of other things that SEAs can and are considering taking on as well. So, the baseline on attendance, question of what is attendance and redefining how we think about attendance in a virtual world, but more concretely, what are the actual mechanisms to do that? Are we, are LEAs simply checking a box if a student shows up, or are we putting in place mechanisms to track actual hours of online engagement, hours of showing up to synchronous sessions, participation in those synchronous sessions that are in place? So we're hearing SEAs not just define these, but in some cases actually build the capabilities to do some of these, to track some of these metrics. We're also, of course, seeing SEAs think about, not just attendance and academics, but also social and emotional well-being data, because there are going to be times when teachers aren't able to rely on their in-person presence with students to check on how students are doing, or for weekly sessions with a counselor to be able to do that. SEAs are thinking creatively about how to build in mechanisms to check on students, whether that's leveraging existing virtual assessments, building system-wide surveys that students, parents, and teachers can respond to, that LEAs can use, and providing other resources and ideas for LEA staff to do individual check-ins with their own staff or directly with students. And then on the academic side, we're seeing SEAs develop new policies and guidelines for the high stakes assessments, but also to establish new protocols and support the resourcing and the tooling of assessments that can be done, if they need to be done virtually, just to take the temperature on where students are, especially when they first come back in the fall. So determining and encouraging new timelines for academic assessments, developing or modifying virtual assessments, taking what was done online but delivered, and proctored in schools, making modifications so that it can be done outside of school, in students' homes, other community centers, et cetera. And then we're also seeing some SEAs create platforms that teachers can use to submit surveys on student development, not necessarily to the SEAs, but submit those surveys to their LEAs, supported by a platform from the SEAs. Some of the questions that you may want to be asking are how do we use the tools that we already have in place, modify those so that they can be done virtually, so that they cover topics of remote engagement and virtual engagement. What flexibilities and experiments might we have been trying before, that we could now use and try to scale up? And have we thought about how to address academic integrity in online assessments? In Egypt, just to give another example, they replaced their exams with projects for grades 3 through 7, recognizing that those students weren't going to be able to take the traditional quizzes and exams. This was for more for the grades for these students. The high school students still did take electronic exams on tablets, but then for the very young children, they actually turned the parents into assessment resources. So they gave parents a checklist of things that they should ask their students and check in on their students to share back with their teachers, to get a more what's happening even when the teachers can't be in person. Finally, in the area of community engagement, again, this is not necessarily new, but on steroids. So more frequent, more stakeholders, and frankly, higher stakes. So two main things that we are hearing SEAs consider, and that we've been seeing outside of the US, are involving stakeholders in decision making. So this has been happening a lot over the last couple of months, when polling families, polling teachers, polling LEA administrators on their feelings about what school should look like in the fall, their readiness, their own risk factors. But what we're seeing internationally, what we're hearing SEAs prepare for, is that this isn't going to stop. This has to keep going. There will continue to be decisions that have to be made every month, some of them large. When do we switch from remote into back into some form of in-person, or small? Are the AB days working? Are the transportation guidelines working for families, working for LEAs? So you can be thinking about what forums you put in place that are sustainable for the full year, especially if you've been kind of bootstrapping it for the last couple of months in the scramble. So let's go back one more for a minute, please. Thanks. And then finally, question about how do you establish clear lines of communication when you have information to share. So in Denmark, the ministry created a hotline to answer questions about the virus and health measures by phone or chat in 25 languages. In Singapore, they created a chatbot to do the same. So essentially, both of these were examples of scaling up the ability to respond to questions because the volume of questions will inevitably be higher. More close to home in the US, one SEA, I'm sure many of you are doing this, but have weekly meetings with all superintendents just as an open channel, both to receive feedback, but also to share new information that's coming. So again, these are all examples of things we've heard. Our guess is that, while one deputy we spoke to said, I expect that by September, I'm not going to remember the job that I used to do last year because so much is going to be different. Doesn't necessarily mean that everything will be different everywhere. But our hope is, again, that some of these examples, some of these questions will help you think about, come November, what are the things we may need to be thinking about then? Come March, what do we need to be thinking about then, and how can we be ready for it? Any questions or reactions, or, in particular, are there any changes to responsibilities or new responsibilities that any of you have either already put in place or are considering putting in place for the school year that we didn't cover?
Jimmy, I'll jump in. I got a text around this question of getting information out to the people in the field that districts don't typically get information out to. So specifically, it's around getting like SEA guidance into the hands of like local pediatricians, right? So you're crossing the streams, right? Like you've got education people trying to get to networks of health officials and vice versa. And that may be something for us to continue to explore or look for models of how states are doing that and reaching these communities they haven't typically reached before. But that may be something for further investigation. Yeah,
well, I mean, and just a quick reflection. I mean, there are a couple of states that I'm aware of that are using their collaboration with their departments of health to do exactly that. Mm-hmm. To get, because both, the health agencies both have connections directly to pediatricians, to other healthcare providers, but also have access to county health departments that have those relationships, et cetera. So that is a great avenue and a great way to take advantage of that mm-hmm. collaboration that you're probably already doing with your health agencies.
Right, and becoming a trusted resource. That's the challenge. That a local pediatrician would look to the Department of Education for guidance as opposed to their health. So it's an interesting question to explore.
Yeah, that's great. Any other questions or areas that we didn't touch on that that folks are planning for? Okay. Well, then let's move on to one of the areas we raised, which is what is the SEA's role and how should we think about making the decision and informing the decision for switching between school models from between face-to-face, hybrid, and remote. So I'll pass to my colleague Leah to talk through this.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. So in terms of, as Jimmy mentioned, this next section, we will be talking about the process, the decision-making process in terms of switching between models. So some schools saying, or some districts announcing that they're planning for 100% remote and thinking about what the process will be during the year as they will potentially move from that initial plan potentially into a hybrid model, potentially to face-to-face, or in other areas it could be going in a different direction. So we're going to talk a bit about what that process looks like and some factors. On this slide, what we've teed up is that, when you think about the SEA role in this process of thinking of moving from one model to another, there are several different examples of roles that SEAs could play. And so what we've laid out here on the left-hand side of this page, this is where we see SEAs potentially playing more of a hands-off role, kind of having less engagement in the actual decision-making process. So here you see LEAs most likely making decisions independently. And then as we move to the right on the page, you see more SEA engagement, and I'll talk through each of these models. The first four, these are all models where really LEAs are the primary decision maker. But as you move to the right, there's more engagement of SEAs. So in this, I mentioned the first one, really, LEAs are really making the decisions independently in terms of the model, the remote, hybrid, or in person, or some other combination. In the next one, this is more of an example of where SEAs are working with other state agencies. You know, Jimmy spent a lot of time in terms of talking about the critical role that health agencies are playing in this process. So potentially collaborating with health agencies or the agriculture agencies and thinking about what guidance is needed and distributing that to LEAs, but not going so far as to define thresholds. In the next one, moving to the middle column here, this is where we see kind of even more hands-on role. And in this one, what we've teed up is in some states, and we'll talk about this on the next page, in some states, there's an overall reopen plan. So there's a reopen plan that addresses potentially not just K-12 and how to think about reopening schools, but it addresses restaurants and retail and places of worship and other settings. And so K-12 is kind of one of multiple areas that could be addressed in an overall state level reopen plan, and sometimes with thresholds and indicators tied to that. And so how the SEAs collaborate and coordinate with that overall plan is another one to consider. The next one over, this fourth one, this is an example of SCAs actually setting the thresholds, kind of coordinating with other agencies, but getting much more specific in terms of, you know, at this moment in time, based on what we know about COVID, based on what we know about key indicators to track, both what are the indicators to be thinking about, as well as what are some key thresholds. And we'll talk about some examples of states that have been specific about both defining metrics and thresholds vis-a-vis different models for K-12 schools. So those are all four of the examples of LEAs really being the primary decision maker. The last example is here where it's more of the key role is both, you know, at the state level with the governor's office, with the SCA, really saying, mandating what model the LEA will take and how the LEA will move from one model to another throughout the school. So again, wanted to tee up that there's this spectrum of models, again, really thinking about what's the role of the SEA. Two things that we wanted to flag in terms of kind of almost regardless of the model, but particularly in the models where the LEA is more of the primary decision maker, the role that the SEA can play that's really critical in enabling and supporting LEAs. And this is the first is in terms of the data role. We're going to spend, this is where I'll spend most of the time today, is talking about the role that SEAs can play in terms of helping LEAs with data, whether that's recommending metrics, getting clear on the thresholds, actually collecting, sharing the data, or you know, reinforcing the importance of making database decisions. And then the second is playing a convening role. In the last webinar, we spent some time sharing examples of how SEAs are playing a convening role across LEAs. So we're going to spend less time on the convening role today. But again, that's another, almost regardless of the model, a way that we're seeing SEAs really support this process of thinking about sharing best practices in different models. So on this page, you know, I mentioned on the last page the fact that, you know, across in some, for some SEAs, they're in a context where the states have reopened plans, have phased reopen plans. So we know that in 28 states, the states have released phased reopen plans. In K-12, kind of the plan for K-12 reopening is mentioned in the plans in terms of what phases look like. We know another 13 states have phased reopen plans, but K-12 isn't mentioned typically, and then another 10 kind of don't have phase guidance. This is just to say that there's really a range of kind of, in terms of reopen more broadly, a range of situations that SEAs are likely facing. And also we know in terms of just the state of reopen plans, given where the number of cases we're seeing across the US, that a lot, in terms of reopen plans, a lot of those are either being paused or revisited. And so how you think about connecting to the reopen plans or progressing relative to those could vary state to state, SEA. So now talking more about the data. So on that first slide, I mentioned how data, almost regardless of the engagement model that an SCA has, data is so critical and is such a valuable role for the SCA to play in terms of sharing that data and thinking about, in particular, some of the health metrics. So on the left-hand side, this is where, and I know there's a lot of discussion constantly, whenever you open a newspaper, always looking at what are some of the different health metrics, whether it's in your local community, state, or nationally. And we know that this is, and we'll share some data that we've looked at in terms of how some of this data is playing into the decisions around reopening schools or not. And so for the SCA, thinking about what are some of the most relevant metrics? And some of the, this case count, the prevalence, the number of deaths, cumulative deaths, the test rate, the positive test rate, hospitalizations, hospital capacity, contact tracing capabilities. These are some typical things that are being tracked by state health agencies. But in addition to that, we're seeing a lot of SCAs also thinking about actually what's our system readiness. And if you look at the school level or at the LEA level, how ready are we to open? And almost regardless of the health metrics. We talked in some of the interviews we conducted with SCAs, we heard them share, even if the health metrics weren't indicating a certain model, sometimes the readiness, looking at our ability to actually implement health and safety protocols, there wasn't a lot of confidence in that. So the readiness, whether it was support from the teachers or support from parents or otherwise, that might factor into a decision in terms of which model you're in. On this slide, we wanted to tee up an example dashboard. So this is an example of a state health agency dashboard. So this is not to say this is something that the SCA should develop on their own, but much more of how can you collaborate with your state health agency in terms of some of the health metrics that I mentioned on the slide before that are going to be critical to track, whether at the state level or helping the LEAs track those at the local level. And in here, from everything in the top left-hand corner in terms of testing to actual number of cases to deep dives on certain populations. But again, an example of a dashboard. And so either thinking of what's the coordination that you're doing with a health agency to get the data, or what is the subset of this data that's really most relevant to you as an SCA or to the LEAs for making the decision around school and in terms of what model to go to. We also looked at the 30 largest districts in the US to see if you look at the health data and you look at any plans that have been announced around reopen, what does it say? Are you seeing how does the data actually factor into some of the models that have been announced so far? What's interesting is in terms of, if you look at the left-hand row here, so the 15 of the 30 largest school districts that have announced a remote model for at least the beginning of the year, you look at the data, the health metrics for those districts, relative to the other ones, they actually have average, a higher average prevalence rate. In particular, where what really stands out the most is in terms of what the growth rate is in cases. And also, if you look at the graph itself, what also stands out is in terms of, in many of those districts, they're experiencing a positive growth rate in cases. So in that, you would say, okay, that a lot of those decisions, you can see how the health metrics were likely factoring and playing a role in the decision to select a remote model. And the same thing whether you're looking at hybrid or the option for in-person, where the option for in-person, overall, most of the health metrics are relatively better, and in particular, the negative growth, they're seeing a negative growth rate in cases. So again, just to say how you might pull the data together or help to present this to LEAs to make an informed decision on their initial model for the school year, as well as thinking about the model that they could go to throughout the year. We also wanted to share some of where we're seeing decisions that have already been made or already announced on what model districts are going to take for the coming year. And these are examples of LEAs that have announced plans for remote instruction. And what's interesting here is that, again, you look at the health data, and many of these you're seeing either confirmed, whether you look at the confirmed cases or the growth rate. What we heard across a number of these is that it's not just the health metrics that factored in to the decision. And some, so for example, in California, a lot of the concerns around the ability to test for COVID at schools, as well as in Georgia, really thinking about what's the sentiment of teachers and community members in terms of their support for going back to a hybrid or an in-person model. So some of those other factors, other than just the health metrics, really factoring in to some of these decisions around the model that's being selected for the start of the school year. But again, if you look at some of the quotes on the right-hand side, I think what we're hearing a lot is that the model for the beginning of the year could evolve, and it could evolve quickly. And so I think this is one thing that we're really hoping to talk about in this section is how can you make sure that you as an SEA, that you're equipped with the right data and that you're tracking the right things to help make the decision around potentially moving from one model to another. We spent some time on the last webinar talking a lot about the international examples. What can we learn from international examples? And we wanted to go back to that today, in particular because we think that there's a lot to learn in terms of not just how are other school systems thinking about reopening, but how have they potentially moved between models and what led to some of those decisions. So here are a couple of examples from the UK, from Leicester. What we saw here was that the decision to close schools because of a localized outbreak, and also because of a specific, unusually high incidence of COVID among children. And so making the decision that schools won't fully reopen until September to ensure that they can really have the right accommodations, health and safety protocols in place. In Germany, what was interesting, and again, we thought this was relevant for SEAs, because this is an example of an SEA equivalent, the state chief minister, the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, announcing that an entire district, the district of Gütersloh, that would close for 7 days, including schools, because of an outbreak in a factory. So again, kind of a SEA, at the state level, making the decision around a district closure, given the health metrics and kind of what the state of the virus in that local community. And then the example of South Korea, again, the decision at a local level, but in Seoul and nearby metropolitan areas, the health minister announcing over 500 schools closing because of a surge in cases and other lockdown measures being considered. So again, this movement of, not just thinking about the reopening like we spent time on last time, but moving between models, also examples of how even several months in, having to move to lockdown or to hybrid or remote model. So I'll pause there. If there are questions, feel free to either text Steve, which kind of in the last section that seemed to work quite well, or shoot them over the chat and we'll answer them. I might just kind of, if those questions come in, I'll just move on to the next section and then we can spend some time at the end just to see kind of what questions there might be overall. But I think this next section, for those of us who've been preparing the webinar, this is content that we think is very exciting, which is around how do you really help prepare LEAs to test their plans. And we think this is exciting because there are a lot of different options. There are options from things as simple as checklists or rubrics, comparing LEA plans to guidance, or having facilitated forums. What we're going to spend time on today is more of a hands-on model, or more of a tool, which is the day in the life tool. And so this is to do a tabletop exercise, a simulation exercise, something that I know all of you are deeply experienced in from other events other than pandemics, just in terms of preparing for different types of emergencies, different types of crises. But we want to talk specifically about how could you potentially help share a tool with LEAs to help them prepare, do a tabletop, which we're calling the day in the life of exercise. So there are three main outputs in a day in the life exercise. The first is getting very clear on the steps in the day, or the process steps. So, and we're going to talk here about a student, an example student named Malik, and what Malik's day looks like. So that's the first one, is really getting clear on what are the key steps or the journey in Malik's journey. The second one is kind of as you look at the steps, as you look at the questions for each step, what are potential answers? This is where you get into really testing the plans or helping the LEAs test the plans they've put in place to see kind of have they thought through all of the different pieces that might be needed as they plan for reopening. And this is applicable to a 100% remote environment as much as a hybrid or fully in person. And then the third output is the what if scenarios. So these are all of the, and I thought we, you know, in one of the interviews we did with a district chief, she shared, you know, you might call them what ifs. They're actually all when. These are when these scenarios happen, because they will happen. But there's scenarios that kind of, when you think about the typical path, that are off, you know, something that's unanticipated. And so how are you planning for some of those unanticipated scenarios to pressure test on atypical days? So here I talked about that initial, the process steps or the journey. So again, this is, you know, we're taking Malik, a 4th grade in-person general education student, and really laying out what Malik's typical day is. So everything from Malik traveling to school by bus to what the school arrival experience is, getting the temperature screening done, going to the homeroom to sit in the class, having class, eating lunch, going to recess, having afternoon class, and then either going home or going to aftercare. So kind of thinking about all of those steps in a typical journey, and then teeing up all of the questions that likely come up. And we'll go into Malik's arrival at school more in depth, but it's the questions around, you know, where does Malik go after disembarking from the bus? Who conducts the health screening? What does Malik do after he passes the health screening? Or then the atypical, what happens if he were not to pass the screening? But again, all of those questions, and then what's the protocol that's been developed to answer each of the questions. So I mentioned, you know, let's talk about just this one deep dive on the one step of the school arrival. So in the typical journey, we say, you know, arrives at school, goes to the building entrance for his cohort, waits 6 feet apart from the next student to get the temperature check. A staff member takes the temperature wearing the appropriate PPE with a no contact thermometer, does the check, normal, no symptoms, and then he's allowed to enter the building, sanitizes the hands, goes to the homeroom. This is not, you know, in terms of developing this level of specificity, is not something that the SEA would do, but something that in terms of as a toolkit, as an approach to share with LEAs to help them actually go through and pressure test. And some things that we've teed up in the upper right-hand corner, really for kind of how an SEA might be involved in the process, is you might say in terms of kind of, it's really important to monitor the health metrics, because you might say we need different health protocols, we might need different measures for different steps in the process. Or you might say that, you know, on this we're seeing actually a real need across districts as they're doing the day in the life of exercise. We're seeing that potentially a gap is PPE, or that there's a gap around transportation in terms of actually pressure testing how the transportation plan will work. So as a role for the SEA potentially to play in helping to address that funding gap. So it's one thing to think about kind of the typical process, but when things get really interesting are when you talk about the atypical process. What happens when something goes wrong? Or as the, you know, district chief shared with us, when something, you know, inevitably goes wrong. So let's say Malik goes to school, gets the health screening, and doesn't pass. What happens then? And I think this is where the question, you know, for the SEA, it's a bit around how much are you going to be tracking some of these metrics around either confirmed cases or suspected cases, or working potentially with LEAs to coordinate with local health authorities to make sure that adequate testing is provided, that adequate information is provided to families on any potential or confirmed cases. So again, you know, when you're, you know, and working with the LEA in terms of the day in the life, actually going through what's the protocol for the divergent journey, I won't go through that today, but in terms of the work that an SEA could do with an LEA, it's really helping the LEA think through, you know, what happens when you go through this path. Will the LEA or the school report that there's a failed health screening or that there's a positive test to the SEA? Kind of what's going to be that relationship? What expectations is an SEA going to set in terms of some of these atypical or divergent journeys? And so in terms of, you know, in terms of actually building out the dialogue, so we've shared kind of some specifics about what it could look like. What we wanted to share is how it could actually evolve, because we've heard both from, you know, SEAs that are giving this tool to LEAs as well as LEAs that have been actually implementing it, that there are a couple of different versions and wanted to share what it could look like. The first on the far left, this is kind of initial virtual testing. So, pressure testing the plan with your team to identify pitfalls in the protocols that you've established. The next might be more advanced virtual testing and training. That's when you think you've kind of really addressed most of the pitfalls, engaging a broader set of stakeholders, principals, staff, teachers, participate in the simulation. It's to train the stakeholders, but also to help build confidence in the plan. And then the next one is actually, we've heard examples of physical simulations at schools. So actually running through the day in the life at a school. And then this could help, and then you could invite a broader set of community members to really strengthen the communications and pressure test the plan even more. And one example to share with you is even further to the right is we've heard some examples of LEAs actually thinking about how can they put the plan, use kind of almost do a pilot, bring some cohort back early or do something to help pressure test the plan so that there's a way to not just do it virtually or to do a simulation, but actually put the plan into practice. So a couple of different examples of how the simulation could play out. And then finally, some options in terms of what you could do to provide this resource to your LEAs. The first is making the toolkit available to LEAs. The second would be actually hosting webinars, hosting training sessions to explain how the day in the life of toolkit works. The third is you could set the expectation. You're expecting LEAs to do it, you're requiring them to do it, and then submit their output to you all as part of the reopen plan. The next is you could help to facilitate some simulations with select LEAs, record it and share it to make it more broadly available. Again, tying back to some of the role of the SCA actually convening LEAs. And then finally, hosting working sessions with LEAs to help facilitate their day in the life of simulation. And so just to wrap up, we could say, take a step back and say, any questions on the content overall, what's resonated, anything in terms of new responsibilities, decision-making for switching between models, this day in the life of toolkit, or potentially anything, challenges that you're wrestling with or anticipating, or anything in terms of support, how you're thinking through supporting LEAs throughout the year that might be helpful to address. I know we have a few minutes left. So just if you have any questions, either unmute or enter them into chat. Great. I see that there's a question on the day in the life of, and thank you for, it's great that you found that useful. It is fully fleshed out. We actually have a toolkit. Steve, maybe, I don't know if you want to talk more, but we have more. This is actually just a very limited subset of a lot of the day in the life of content, but Steve, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, we've got that, and the McKinsey team has been great about pulling that together. So we have, just as Leah said, we have a toolkit. We're just kind of putting it together. We'll get it out on our lists and put it in our shared folders and the ways that you guys have typically accessed our stuff. So we'll have that for you, and it goes into way more detail than this and different models. And I don't remember, Leah, how many pages it is, but it's a big one. So there's a lot there. So we will get that out to you guys. Yeah,
I would say one thing on the day in the life of, in the broader toolkit that Steve mentioned, is, so what we shared with you was just a tiny kind of subset of it. It was one, we call it persona. Malik is one persona. Malik is the student, what his day was, and we assumed in person. What you could also do is you'd want to think about other personas. So what is potentially a teacher's experience? What's the day in the life of a teacher? We have that as part of the day in the life toolkit. What's the experience of a parent in remote learning? That's another toolkit. So I mean, that's another persona to think about in the toolkit. And then you could also think about, from the different ages, what's elementary versus middle versus high school. So wanting to help you kind of in thinking about how you could apply the toolkit and be looking at different personas, looking at different, and then looking at the different scenarios, all the questions, and then we've teed up a lot of different what ifs. And Julia just shared a link to the toolkit. So hopefully you can access it, and if you have any further questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Other questions? Anything else that's resonated as you look across that? That was a lot to go through. Anything else in terms of ways that we can support you in this? That we talked about the toolkit. There's a lot of other pieces in there. And again, we're almost out of time, but let us know if there are other pieces that you looked at. And we'll get the slide deck out so you can take some more time with this. There's a lot of data in there, so we know we'll come back with some of that. But let us know if there's any ways that we can help you with any of those other pieces. All right.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Yes. Anything else for the good of the order? McKinsey team, anything we want to mention before we go?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you're doing.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your spending some time with us today. Again, all these resources will be posted, so you'll have them as soon as we can get them loaded up. And let us know if you need anything more, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.